People still argue about what really doomed the 1958 Edsel Citation. But the truth hides in places most folks never bother to look. Maybe you've heard the jokes, maybe you've seen the photos, but have you ever stood beside one and felt its weight, its presence, its strange kind of pride? Because back in the late 50s, America was riding high on the open road. New suburbs were blooming. V8s ruled the streets, and Detroit believed the future would be built out of chrome and courage. Ford wanted more than another model. They wanted a whole new dynasty, and in their brightest moment of confidence, they gave birth to the Edsel brand, with the Citation crowned as its flagship. Tell me, have you ever seen a Citation up close? If you have, you know why this story isn't as simple as a failure. To understand why the 1958 Edsel Citation ever rolled into the daylight, you have to step back into Ford Motor Company in the early 1950s, an empire buzzing with optimism and hungry to claim every inch of America's booming car market. Chevy and Plymouth were selling to the young families just starting out. Mercury was courting the comfort-seeking middle crowd, and Lincoln stood tall at the luxury peak. But in that wide gap between Ford and Mercury, executives saw money, real money, driving away to Buick and Oldsmobile showrooms. So Ford's leadership made a decision that felt inevitable at the time: create an entirely new division, one with its own identity, badge, and engineering philosophy. Naming it after Edsel Ford was meant to tie the brand to something graceful, refined. Inside Dearborn's conference rooms, designers and engineers pushed through late-night meetings, sketching big dreams in pencil and coffee stains. They believed they were crafting the next great chapter of classic American cars. All of that anticipation built toward E-Day, September 4th, 1957, when Ford unveiled the new marque in a whirlwind of national advertising. Maybe you've seen some of those old campaigns floating around today, the ones calling the Edsel the car of the future. When the curtains dropped and crowds leaned forward, the Citation stood at the front of the stage like a polished silver torch. Its vertical grille, tall, narrow, outlined in bright chrome, was the first detail anyone noticed. And depending on who you ask, it was either bold or bizarre. Even now, if you've ever caught yourself pausing to stare at that front end, wondering whether you like it or not, well, you're not the only one. Detroit never built another face quite like it. Chrome spears ran down the sides, catching sunlight like a blade sliding free of a sheath. The tail fins pressed upward just enough to nod at the fin wars sweeping across late 50s highways, but without tipping into excess. The 1958 Edsel Citation looked long, confident, and unmistakably American. No mistaking it for anything else rumbling down the boulevard. And inside, it was all ambition. Two-tone leather, deep carpets, metallic thread fabrics glinting under the dome lights. The dash had a theatrical flair, almost proud of itself. And there, right in the center of the steering wheel, sat the Teletouch transmission pad, those strange little buttons that promised a futuristic driving experience. If you've ever wondered what it felt like to shift gears with nothing but your thumb, the Citation had its answer. Under that enormous hood, the E400 410 cubic inch V8 delivered a factory-rated 345 horsepower, numbers backed up by period brochures and service sheets. It wasn't a muscle car by definition, but it had the kind of torque that moved the roughly 4,500-pound cruiser with a quiet, steady confidence. Ford designed it to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Buick Roadmaster and Chrysler New Yorker, and on paper, the specs put it right in the fight. But even as the marketing surged, radio spots, magazine spreads, showroom banners stretching across Main Street, clouds were already gathering. Ford didn't see them yet, but they were there. A shifting economy, a cooling market, a design too bold for its own good. It's funny how cars sometimes carry the seeds of their own fate in the very features meant to set them apart. And the Citation carried plenty. The first cracks in the Edsel dream appeared long before most Americans ever slid behind the wheel of a 1958 Citation. By late 1957, the US economy was stumbling into a recession, and families who once planned to trade up to bigger, flashier V8 sedans suddenly tightened their belts. Dealerships across the country felt the slowdown. Foot traffic thinned, financing grew harder to secure, and right into that chilly headwind, Ford launched one of the most expensive mid-tier automobiles Detroit had ever attempted to sell. The Citation, meant to be the proud flagship of the new Edsel division, now found itself wearing a price tag many buyers couldn't justify. It sat awkwardly between segments, too expensive for Ford shoppers, not established enough for Mercury or Buick loyalists. And if you ever watched a customer hesitate in a showroom, staring at something they wanted but knew they couldn't afford, you can imagine the feeling that hung over Edsel dealers that fall. Then came the quality problems, the kind no ad campaign could gloss over. Because Edsels were built in multiple factories, some dedicated, some shared, consistency became a moving target. One Citation might roll off the line perfectly aligned, doors shutting with a solid, satisfying click, while the next arrived with trim that didn't line up, leaky gaskets, or electrical quirks that baffled mechanics. Production teams had been rushed. Engineering instructions sometimes arrived incomplete. Prototype components accidentally found their way into real customer cars. And the centerpiece of Edsel innovation, the Teletouch push-button transmission, became one of its earliest headaches. Mounted in the steering wheel hub, the system looked futuristic, but lived perilously close to heat, radiating from the engine bay. Contacts warped, moisture crept in, wires misaligned. Drivers hit the horn and slipped into neutral without meaning to, or found the buttons unresponsive on humid mornings. If you've ever wondered how a single engineering decision can haunt an entire brand, Teletouch is Exhibit A. But mechanical issues were only half the storm. The other half came from America's sense of humor. Newspapers and magazines tore into the vertical grille with relentless jokes. Cartoonists turned it into a national pastime. Some rivals whispered that Ford had built a car with a face only an accountant could love. And once a punchline sticks to a product, it's nearly impossible to peel off. The Edsel name, barely months old, became shorthand for failure almost overnight. Dealers slashed prices in desperation, marking down Citations so heavily that the flagship model sometimes sold for less than mid-range competitors. But even with discounts, customers hesitated. They weren't just buying a car, they were buying the uncertainty attached to it. One by one, unsold Citations collected dust on lots from California to Ohio. By mid-1958, Ford understood the gravity of the situation. The Edsel project, once envisioned as a fourth division alongside Ford, Mercury, and Lincoln, was collapsing under its own weight. They trimmed the lineup for 1959, softened the styling, simplified the engineering. But the damage was done. The brand's reputation was gone, replaced by a national narrative that no amount of chrome or horsepower could reverse. The Citation suffered the most. As the top-tier model, it carried the highest expectations and therefore absorbed the hardest fall. Orders dried up. Production numbers dwindled. And within months, the car meant to be Edsel's crown jewel quietly vanished from brochures. By November 1959, Ford shut the lights off. The factories stopped. The signs came down. The Edsel division, 2 years old, nearly $500 million spent, was gone. A ghost story in Detroit history. Do you think Ford pulled the plug too soon, or was the project doomed from the start? Today, the surviving Citations live quieter, more dignified lives. Some sit in family garages, wrapped under heavy covers like aging movie stars avoiding the sun. Others rest in barns, where dust settles gently over chrome that still glints when the doors open and daylight spills in. And then there are the restored examples, towering, shimmering reminders of what 1950s American luxury looked like before time and technology moved on. If you've ever walked up to one at a car show and felt your steps slow down on instinct, well, you know that the car still has a presence photographs can't capture. Behind the wheel, the Citation feels like stepping into another decade entirely. The steering carries a heaviness modern cars lost long ago. The suspension floats over the pavement with that trademark 1950s softness, more boat than sedan. And the big E400 V8 breathes with a kind of old-school confidence, each pulse of torque rolling through the cabin like the slow rhythm of something alive. Drive it long enough and you start to realize you're not piloting a car, you're piloting a moment in American history. Collectors who keep these machines running don't do it for bragging rights. They do it because the Edsel story resonates in a way success stories never quite can. Success is predictable. Failure, spectacular, ambitious failure, leaves questions behind. It sparks debate. It forces people to wonder what might have happened if timing, economy, and engineering had all lined up differently. And maybe that's why the Citation endures today among rare classic cars. It's a machine built on bold ideas, even if those ideas didn't land the way Ford hoped. Look closely at one today, and that vertical grille doesn't feel like a mistake anymore. It feels like a signature, something daring, something unwilling to blend in. The very thing critics mocked is now exactly what draws people in at shows and cruise-ins. It's the kind of detail only a company chasing the future would gamble on. And love it or hate it, the world is more interesting because cars like the Edsel existed. You can search 1950s American luxury, Edsel collectors, or vintage V8 cruisers, and you'll find that this car's reputation has transformed over the decades. What once symbolized miscalculation now represents courage, the kind Detroit rarely shows anymore. The Citation is more than chrome and steel. It's a reminder of a time when automakers weren't afraid to swing for the fences, even if they struck out hard enough to shake the industry. So as the dust settles and the garage door closes, I like to think the Edsel Citation leaves us with something more valuable than a cautionary tale. It reminds us that the American road was built by people willing to take risks, wild, imperfect, wonderful risks. And every time one of these survivors rumbles to life, it keeps a small piece of that spirit alive. If this story brought back a memory of your own, maybe a car your father drove, a dream you chased, or a classic you let slip away, share it below. I'd love to hear the stories that shaped your road. And if you enjoyed this journey into another slice of forgotten Detroit history, go ahead and like, share, drop a comment, and subscribe for more tales from America's chrome-covered past. See you next time.